The Rolling Stones are back with their 21st studio long-play album. Aptly entitled Dirty Work, its offensiveness necessitated some last-minute editing of a comic strip on the inner sleeve. Prince is back with his album Parade, featuring a sensuous video of the song Kiss with simulated copulation and a picture of Prince on the jacket, strip-teasing, with a tank top to reveal a cross hanging from his neck. But sex isn't the only thing on rock and rollers' minds these days. The famine anthem, We Are the World, stirred political passions among rock and rollers, and causes have become as common as cocaine. Promoter Ken Cragen, USA for Africa president, joined the hands of millions across the whole of America for the sake of the hungry in our land. Amnesty International put together a 6-concert tour featuring Sting and U2. Money went to Amnesty International, an organization that monitors treatment of dissidents around the world, but which conservatives claim supports leftists who focus on repression of right-wing regimes, ignoring communist excesses. Theatrical rock with the likes of Motley Crue and Twisted Sister is still very popular. Heavy metal is far from defunct, but a resurrected patriotism lurks in the land, and rock and roll has gotten into the act. Facing the flag with baseball cap in his hip pocket, Bruce Springsteen has become the boss of patriotism and resurgent admirers of the red, white, and blue. His song Born in the USA is actually an anti-Vietnam song, and it features Springsteen's tune My Hometown on the album of the same name. That particular song celebrates simple American community life. Even President Reagan praised Bruce Springsteen for putting on benefit concerts to aid the unemployed. But there's a more sinister side to the political influence in rock and roll. The new right, openly suspicious of Amnesty International, certainly doesn't feel any better with Sting's album, The Dream of the Blue Turtles. One of the songs on that album is entitled Russians. Here's what the lyrics say. In Europe and America, there's a growing feeling of hysteria, conditioned to respond to all the threats and the rhetorical speeches of the Soviets. Mr. Khrushchev said, we'll bury you. Well, I don't subscribe to that point of view. It'd be an ignorant thing to do if the Russians love their children too. Well, Sting, the question is, do the Russians love their children? How can I save my little boy from Oppenheimer's deadly toy? Sting says. Oppenheimer, of course, one of the fathers of the atomic bomb. There's no monopoly of common sense on either side of the political fence. We share the same biology regardless of ideology. Believe me when I say to you, I hope the Russians love their children too. Well, I do. We're not talking about the Russian people when we speak of the individuals who could plunge this world into a nuclear cataclysm. The question is whether or not Mr. Gorbachev has designs in world domination. Sting goes on to say in his song Russians, there's no historical precedent to put the words in the mouth of the president. There's no such thing as a winnable war. It's a lie. We don't believe anymore. Mr. Reagan says we'll protect you. Well, I don't subscribe to that point of view. Well, here you have it. Sting telling us the President of the United States is lying to us. I remember receiving a call from a teenager one day who defended the song Russians by Sting. I asked her if she knew the name Sherinsky. I hope you do. He's the diminutive Soviet dissident who has spent many years in a Soviet prison. And he says that tattered pages from a worn Bible, including the words of the Psalm, gave him hope to go on in that prison and keep believing someday he would be free. A courageous man. This teenage girl had never heard of Sherinsky, but she knew all the words to Sting's song, Russians. I submit to you that is an example of the way in which the minds of teenagers are being indoctrinated through rock music and the images and lyrics of popular music artists. Is Sting right? Is there no such thing as a winnable war? Is Mr. Reagan lying? Can we trust the communists to be motivated by parental affection? Can we trust Sting? What kind of a man is he? Sting has said, I've tried drugs. I've tried having sex with every woman who came into the room. All that stuff, and none of it satisfied me. He is articulate, and he admits an interest in the occult. The Police song, the Police, the group he used to belong to, Synchronicity, was named for Jung's theory that coincidental events have deeper symbolic meanings. Sting says, I believe in synchronicity. He also goes on to say that the song Every Breath You Take, the big Police hit, came to him in a dream, as did the title of the Dream of the Blue Turtle. It's interesting to note that Jung was also, as was his contemporary and mentor Freud, into the idea of dreams being part of a kind of collective unconsciousness by which we were all affected. Of his days in college, Sting says, "I got drunk every night and blank every woman in sight. I've been through the entire faculty, so I left." His first marriage collapsed about the time his wife had their second child, and he became involved with another woman. He says they had no plans to marry. Newsweek magazine says, and I quote of Sting, "He seriously probes the occult. One of his closest friends is an Indian-born clairvoyant." Sting himself says, "I've had experiences in the last 3 years which I wouldn't have given any credence to before. My interest in the occult coincided with my interest in psychology." Sting claims he can predict events from reading playing cards and that his London house is haunted. He says he once walked into his baby daughter's room and saw all her toy mobiles inexplicably whirling madly. 2 days after seeing the mobiles whirling, he says he saw a woman and a child, an apparition, a demon, standing in the corner of his bedroom. He says the room turned icy cold. What did he do? Call upon the name of the Lord? No, he called in a spiritualist who confirmed the presence of a woman and a small child, and the spiritualist offered to exorcise the spirits. Well, Sting and his paramour decided not to disturb them. Sting now says the aura in the home with these demons, as we know them to be, present, is now quite positive. This is the man we're to trust when he says, "Don't worry, the Russians love their children too." Even Ozzy Osbourne has gotten into this act of talking about the subject of politics. From black magic and upside-down crosses and Satan worship and suicide, Ozzy turned his attention to The Ultimate Sin, which is the name of a recent album. The cover of the Ultimate Sin album pictures Ozzy as a fork-tongued demonic creature oozing from an apocalyptic inferno. The lyrics to The Ultimate Sin say that nuclear war is the ultimate sin, and it's too late to repent. Of course, Christians know the Bible says the unpardonable sin is blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, something which it certainly seems Ozzy has come dangerously close to on a number of occasions with upside-down crosses and black magic hieroglyphics and satanic symbology in his album jackets. Later in the album, The Ultimate Sin, there's a song, "Thank God for the Bomb," in which Ozzy sardonically suggests, "War is just another game, tailor-made for the insane. Thank God for the bomb." Ozzy says, "As far as the ultimate sin goes, I'm leaving that up to each person. Maybe the ultimate sin is nuclear war. Maybe it's adultery. Maybe it's murder. Or maybe it's just getting drunk all the time." Twisted Sister's latest album has come out and play. That's the title. Dee Snider, whose front teeth have been actually filed as sharp-pointed fangs, appears on the front of the album wrapped in seaweed vines and wearing his perpetual showbiz snarl. The song suggests you should be cruel to your school in the name of rock and roll. Now, those kinds of silly sentiments from Twisted Sister are really a very far cry from more serious musical trends. Rock and roll has come of age and has a lot of clout, even in politics. Now, some of it's deliberate, others of it really reflected. For example, the song by Bernie Taupin and Elton John on Elton's album Ice and Fire tells the story of a female Russian soldier with whom the singer is in love. And Elton says, "Do you ever dream of me? Do you ever see the letters that I write when you look through the wire, Nikita? Do you see the stars at night? If there comes a time guns and gates no longer hold you in and you're free to make a choice, look toward the west and find a friend." Sorry, Elton. If she happens to live behind the Iron Curtain, the chances of her getting out for love or friendship are not very likely. Then there are the somewhat oblique lyrics for the song by Mike and the Mechanics, "Silent Running." What are they singing about? No one is really sure. Don't believe the church and state and everything they tell you. Better you should pray to God the Father and the Spirit. Swear allegiance to the flag, whatever flag they offer. What are we to make of the political sentiments in today's music and the people behind it? What about someone like Elton John? Should we listen to what he has to say? Well, in February of 1984, he finally got married. His wife said, "I've heard all the stories about Elton, that he's supposed to be bisexual, but that doesn't worry me." His live-in companion for the last 8 years was described by the press as being in shock. Elton has not only proclaimed bisexuality, but has been very irreligious. A 1983 album, Too Low for Zero, had a song entitled Religion, about drunks finding Jesus in a parking lot and hookers having mystical experiences with a car stereo. A line says, and that's when she got religion in the front of a compact Ford. A rock magazine asked him about revealing his homosexuality, and Elton John said, yeah, I think it hurt my record sales because it's not everybody's cup of tea. I just had to get it off my chest. I expected to offend quite a few people, but I'd rather be honest than live my life as a lie. I don't flaunt it, but I thought it could help other people like that. I'm against bigotry, prejudice, and persecution. I would not play in the United States because of their campaign against homosexuality. What about the flag? The red, white, and blue, the patriotism. What about Ozzy singing about the ultimate sin? Potential apocalypse is the theme of his tune, Killer of Giants. And Ozzy says, if none of us believe in war, then can you tell me what the weapon's for? Listen, if the button is pushed, there'll be nowhere to run. Killer of Giants threatens us all. You know, back in the 60s, John Lennon sang a song called Imagine. He fantasized about a world where there would be no political boundaries and no private ownership of property. John Lennon was intrigued with Marxism back then. He performed for left-wing groups. Today, the song Imagine is a Muzak anthem, but back then, it was only slightly less Marxist than when he sang with the Beatles, You Say You Want a Revolution? Speaking of the political leanings of artists, a punk group called The Clash has always been radical. In fact, Dick Jones of the group was eventually kicked out because he was indifferent to the band's leftist politics. Their concerts featured politically oriented slideshows shown in the back of the stage as they sang tunes like Know Your Rights. They even did an album called Sandinista and praised the Nicaraguan Marxists. The Clash performed in Santa Barbara, California in 1984. Joe Strummer, Clash's singer, declared, I'd like to dedicate this song to Santa Barbara, the only town in America where the Bank of America was burned down. Of the American government, Strummer once said, they're insane. They're smashing around the world, crunching people's hopes, condemning them to starvation and ignorance, waving the banner that says democracy and freedom. What's happening to our young people when they listen to rhetoric like that? And what about Jackson Browne? He has a new album entitled Lives in the Balance. The front of the jacket depicts the face of the Statue of Liberty. A lot of the tunes are politically oriented. Several songs praise the Nicaraguan government, the Sandinistas, and depict America as a domineering meddler. The title song, Brown included members of anti-Contra groups. It was a band dedicated to propagandizing against the Contras. Now, those are the freedom fighters who are trying to do something to rectify the way the revolution has gone bad and a communist Marxist regime has been installed. Rolling Stone magazine said of the album, few would bother to listen to what Jackson Browne thought about American foreign policy if his talent as a rocker hadn't developed along with his gifts as an observer. What does Jackson Browne say about our country? Well, in the song For America, I prayed for America. I was made for America. It's in my blood and in my bones. But he goes on to say, as if freedom was a question of might, as if loyalty was black and white. You hear people say it all the time, my country wrong or right. I want to know what that's got to do with what it takes to find out what's true, with everyone from the president on down lying to keep it from you. Now here, once again, just as with Sting, the suggestion, not the suggestion in this case, the outright accusation that the president of the United States is lying to us. Our leaders can't be trusted. The title song, Lives in the Balance, says, you might what it takes to remember when you know that you've seen it before, where a government lies to a people and a country is drifting to war. He's talking about Central America. On the radio talk shows and the TV, you hear one thing again and again, how the U.S. stands for freedom, and we come to the aid of a friend. But who are the ones that we call our friends? The government's killing their own? Is he just talking loosely? Does he really mean it? Well, Jackson Browne thinks that the region of Central America is a sequel to Vietnam. He says, and I quote, it began to appear to me that the American people were being lied to about a war. I don't think we lost in Vietnam because we were incompetent. I think we lost because we were on the wrong side. Is he suggesting we should have been on the side of the communists? He says, I've heard that phrase, the new patriotism, a few times, but if it's looked at as the latest fad, it'll be gone in a minute. Here's what else Jackson Browne has to say. He was asked in one interview, do you think the Sandinistas, that's the communists, who are now running the government in Nicaragua, he says, do you think the Sandinistas treat people badly? Jackson Browne said, there seem to be some cases where they violated people's rights, but I wouldn't put it the way you put it. I would say their human rights records are much better than those countries that have a distinct military presence, such as El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Now, those are free countries. Those are free countries where churches are not being closed down, where Bibles aren't being confiscated and torn to pieces and dumped in the garbage. But that is happening in Nicaragua, according to the testimony of some evangelical pastors. In the same interview, he was asked the question, do you support the Sandinistas? He said, I don't have to do that to know that what the United States is doing in Nicaragua is wrong. And here's what he says of our country. What we're doing is state terrorism, the supporting of a well-documented, brutal, and barbaric army that kills children, rapes women, and basically wars on civilian populations. And then he was said, do you think President Reagan is lying to the public? He replied, absolutely. It's inconceivable to me that he could be so badly misinformed. In Russia, there's a rock and roll group that's quite popular called Autograph, and many of the rock and rollers there are very political, but without American fervor. One of this, Boris Barenchikov, who's a major Russian rock artist, said recently, we want to exist as a rock and roll band within socialism. We don't want to leave. We want to express our thoughts within the system. After all, there's no difference. Get this. The words of a Russian rock and roller. There's no difference between rock and roll and religion. Speaking of politics, one group called the Gang of Four was very popular in the early 80s. Their lyrics say, in this land right now, some are insane and they're in charge. Comrades, let us seize the time. And yet, when they were asked about the depth of their political views, one member of the group said, I don't know that much about Maoism. I know it's a branch of Chinese communism. Is that all he knows? And he claims to be an expert, and he's telling young people what to believe? And oh, yes, even Motley Crue's on the political bandwagon. Their album, Theater of Pain, contains some political songs. Nikki Sixx of the group says, I want to show that we're just not all blank, which is a reference to male genitals I won't repeat. He says, we have more to say than just about sex. This band is against racism. One of the albums that can be clearly construed to be about prostitution, he says, is about the political implication. He says, we're not talking about prostitution for sex. I'm talking about the song here, Save Our Souls. He says, we're talking about prostitution in general. Everybody prostitutes themselves at one time or another. The Word of God says in Proverbs 13, the law of the wise is a fountain of life to depart from the snares of death. Well, that's not what you find in rock and roll, and it's certainly not what you find in heavy metal rock and roll. For example, the band Venom is the epitome of so-called Satan rock. The band members dress in typical heavy metal style, spandex, leather, chains, and studs. The front album cover of their album Die Hard shows one member wearing an upside-down cross around his neck and another in a tattered T-shirt imprinted with the pentagram goat's head symbol of Satan. Beneath the pentagram are the words of another song on the album entitled Welcome to Hell. If Venom were the only example of the heavy metal genre, its dark and foreboding theme might be dismissed. But they're not alone. Pictured on the cover of a group Celtic Frost album called Emperor's Return is Lucifer, with a serpent's tail and twin horns and his snake-like body entwined with three nearly nude women. One member of the band sports leather biceps, an armband with an upside-down cross. The group Tyrant released an album entitled Legions of the Dead. An advertisement described it as blood-curdling metallic storm. The European band Destruction has an album entitled Infernal Overkill, and they are proclaimed as, quote, Germany's leading death metal squad. Now, that's what their own advertisements emphasize, the death aspect, a death metal squad. The heavy metal label Megaforce Records recently released an album entitled Blessed Death, featuring two clerical hands posed prayerfully, rising from the flames of hell. Another Megaforce album is by the group Stormtroopers of Death. Gates to Purgatory is the name of an album by the group Running Wild. Their songs include Soldiers of Hell and Diabolic Force. The West Coast band Armored Saints addresses death in their song Long Before I Die with the lyrics, lay your cards on the table and draw. From now on, I call the shots long before I die. Dave Pritchard of the group declares, I guess you could say we're thrill seekers. We saw a lot of other heavy metal bands moving to the right and softening their sound, so we decided to move to the left. Well, thankfully, the bands I've just mentioned have no gold or platinum albums, and they're not at the top of the charts. But Twisted Sister is. When they asked Dee Snider how he prepares for a concert, Dee Snider, the leader of Twisted Sister, said, I think about things I hate. Dee Snider has made national headlines, testifying before a Senate committee investigating porn rock. He says of their artistic efforts, heavy metal is the only form of music that has retained a basic element of rock and roll, rebellion. Well, in a way, Twisted Sister is the Dirty Harry of rock. That's the way. Dee Snider described himself, the Dirty Harry of rock. He says, we're doing terrible things, but for the right side and the right reason. He also says, there's something else besides the sexism and the Satan worship and the drug and alcohol references that give heavy metal a bad name. He says there are certain bands that are so ridiculously horrible, people are going to see them and they don't know they're horrible. It's the level of horribleness they're achieving that's their appeal. He says, blank, I'm a dirtbag and I'm not ashamed of it, but I'm not afraid to stand up and say I'm proud to play heavy metal rock and roll. Speaking of this death, dark side of rock and roll, listeners of Talk Back with Bob Larson had the opportunity to hear Christian lawyer Tom Anderson talk about a lawsuit he filed on behalf of parents of a teenage boy who killed himself after listening to several hours of Ozzy Osbourne records. Specifically, a young man, John McCollum's parents, claim Ozzy's song Suicide Solution tipped the balance in favor of death in their troubled son's mind. What influenced him? The lyrics of Ozzy singing, wine is fine, but whiskey's quicker. Suicide is slow with liquor. Where to hide? Suicide is the only way out. Don't you know that's what it's really all about? Is there a specter of self-destruction hanging over the world of rock and roll? What do we make of heavy metal bands who feign or literally swear allegiance to the devil with mocking morbidity in their lyrics? When John McCollum's body was discovered, he was still wearing stereo headphones. He'd been listening to the Ozzy tune Paranoid that says, I think I'll lose my mind if I don't find something to gratify. Can you help me? Won't you bore my brains? I tell you to end your life. I wish I could mine. It's too late. Attorney Anderson argues that a California law prohibiting assistance or encouragement of suicide applies in this case. He says, I'm going to teach CBS Records and Ozzy Osbourne a lesson. What about the influence of death in rock and roll? Robert Duncan, a rock and roll writer, has written a book entitled Only the Good Die Young. In it, he analyzes the tragic and untimely deaths of famous rock and roll stars from Jimi Hendrix to Keith Moon of The Who and Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. In his book, Duncan declares, this book is about rock's attraction to death and death's attraction to rock. There's always been a strange and terrible connection between rock and roll and death. Many of the greats of rock have died long before their time, some the victims of their own lifestyle, others the victims of twists of fate. As the song says, if there's a rock and roll heaven, you know they have a hell of a band. Well, a band that does emphasize hell is Motley Crue. Their specialty is pentagrams, emblazoned in their costumes, flaunted in staging. When asked if their song Shout at the Devil deals with Satanism. Nikki Sixx of the band stated, "We're saying that anyone who keeps you down, whether it's your parents, your teacher, your boss, they're the devil. They're the ones you've got to stand up and shout at." But death has dogged Motley Crue. Lead singer Vince Neil was charged with vehicular manslaughter while under the influence of alcohol. Driving drunk down the wrong side of a highway, he struck another vehicle head-on. Sitting next to him was Nicholas Dingley of the Finnish band Hanoi Rocks. Dingley was killed instantly. Indeed, death, destruction, and hell are recurrent themes in heavy metal rock.
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn the cassette over at this point for the continuation of the message on Side 2.
Not long ago, the Superior Court judge in California ordered Vince Neil, as a result of the accident, to spend 30 days in jail. The sentence was given in addition to Vince Neil's cash restitution of $2.7 million to the injured and dead parties, pocket change for him, 5 years probation, and 200 hours of community service work. Of his charge regarding vehicular manslaughter, Vince Neil says, "I didn't know how the fans would react after the accident. I didn't know if they saw me smiling, if they'd go, 'How can that guy be smiling after what's happened?' What blanked me off was I read in the magazines, Motley Crue mellowed out because they have a warning against drinking and driving. To people like that, I say, blank you, man." Nikki Sixx of the group says, "We won't ever say anything against having a good time and blank," I can't use these words, blanking around. "If it would involve hurting other people yourself, we think you ought to say something." Nick Mars of the group says, "I'm just as sick as the others, although I prefer to do my sickness in private." And by the way, he's the son of a Baptist minister. The first album by Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love, pictured on the cover a photograph of a man's crotch. He wore tight leather pants, studded leather straps, and handcuffs hung from his belt. Of course, all that has changed. They've become more successful. They're rich now. They don't have to grab the public attention with such sensationalism as before. Now, drummer Tommy Lee says, "We don't wear leather insteads now. That was last year's costume. We changed to some outfits that are a little more sparkly and visual. Our motto is entertainment or death." One of their songs, entitled Bastard, says, "Out go the lights, in goes my knife, pull out his life." Nikki Sixx defends the song. He says, "Well, if people think life is all peaches and cream, they're just fooling themselves. I'm not negative. I'm a mirror. If kids come to see us and get out their aggressions, they leave drained rather than going out and robbing. Hey, we're the good guys." What about other themes of a dark and deathly nature? About a year ago, the group Grim Reaper displayed an album with death pictured as a skeleton riding a horse. On the horse's harness was a goat's head and various occult signs, including the pentagram. The back of the album jacket pictured a hooded skeleton with a sickle, death personified, and various black magic hieroglyphics in a sacred satanic circle. The most popular cut off the album was a song called "See You in Hell." The lyrics say, "I make you an offer you can't refuse. I keep my eyes on you because I tell you what to lose. Now you come with me to a place you know so well. I'll take you to the very gates of hell. I'll make you burn." Another tune off the album features the same theme of death. It's called "Wrath of the Ripper." The song is about a murderer. And it says, "The smell of death is in the air. No one seems to care. While the Ripper's on the run, he slips back into the night for some young woman who will never see daylight." One of the more offensive of all the groups is W.A.S.P, are sexual perverts. Blackie Lawless of the group calls their stage show Electric Vaudeville. The current show features replicas of decapitated heads of members of the band sticking on stakes 13 feet in the air with smoke coming out of them. Blackie Lawless says, "In 20 years, I want to be like Jabba the Hutt of rock and roll. Huge, wrinkled, fat, and saying, 'More chicks, more wine.'" Their fan club offers bumper stickers saying, "Don't drive drunk or blind." Tongue-in-cheek, obviously. Blackie says, "Rock and roll is like the ocean. You can have a great time in it, but you must respect it, because if you don't, it'll take your life." Their new show is without the previous psychodramatic stage trappings. They don't have any more blood-filled skulls and women stretched out in racks. Their latest album, The Last Command, has a sticker proclaiming, "The lyrics may be considered offensive by some audiences." I guess so. 2 songs in the album are called Sex Drive, the other Ball Crusher. They're the primary reason for the sticker. Of the attempt to label records regarding suggestive lyrics, Blackie Lawless says, "There's really not much difference between people telling you not to listen to certain types of rock and roll and telling you what to read. Kids are sharp. We want to think they're sweet and innocent, but most of them aren't. What we do is extreme. It's entertainment. There's a lot of sickness in our society, but those people would be there whether there was W.A.S.P. or not." I don't see anything wrong with sex, Blackie says. Nothing wrong with sex and violence, as long as violence is presented in a very theatrical way. It's therapeutic for kids. But we're turning our attention in a more sexual direction for this tour. Is he just doing it to be popular? Is it all a gimmick? Blackie says, "I studied the occult for about 3 years, 7 years ago, and I determined it's a lot of blank. I don't believe in it." Their song, Rage War, he says, is about a contemporary sorcerer and an older one who you later find out is the devil. One group that has consistently emphasized occultic themes is Iron Maiden. Their song, Hallowed Be Thy Name, contains the words, "If there is a God, why has he let me die? As I walk, all my life drifts before me. If the end is near, I'm not sorry. Touch my soul, 'cause it's willing to fly away. Don't worry, now that I've gone beyond to seek the truth." But the song is ostensibly about a prisoner being executed. It's pretty obvious the words have other connotations. Of their album Power Slave, Bruce Dickinson of the group says, "The title song describes the Pharaoh of ancient Egypt on his deathbed. He's known as a life giver. When he dies, everything in the country dies as well. The Pharaoh says, 'I'm a god, I'm all-powerful.' He takes that attitude to the grave with him. So when his tomb is opened, what's unleashed is incredible. It's the ultimate in evil." Their tour to advertise the album was called the World Slavery Tour. It featured 800 lights and a 30-foot-high image of their mascot, a skeleton named Eddie, who's pictured as a mummy. The band even keeps a full-time pyrotechnician on the payroll to ensure that all the flash pots and flames are working. That's right. An expert, full-time, just to make sure there's plenty of flames. Their later album, Live After Death, pictures their skeletal mascot Eddie rising up out of a grave. Nearby is a tombstone quoting the words of H.P. Lovecraft. Quote, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, but with strange eons even death may die." Dio, formerly of Black Sabbath and now of his own, has often featured death and rock and roll imagery. His latest tour, featuring the album Sacred Heart, shows on stage the leering visage of a horned, red-eyed creature symbolizing Satan. His song, Rock and Roll Children, declares, "It was starting to rain on the night they first decided. It was blinding with snow on the night that they ran away. They were found in the dark, but they never returned, just like someone slammed the door." Ironically, Dio declares, "There's so much negative things associated with heavy metal these days. Blood, guts, and a mentality that often seems non-existent. Our music is escape from reality." In his song, The King of Rock and Roll, Dio states, "He's the king of rock and roll. Bad blood, everybody knows it. He'll scratch your soul. He's the king of rock and roll." Well, he may not be singing about Satan, but it certainly sounds like it. That's no wonder Dio originated the satanic horn salute. Coupled with the word Sacred Heart with the visage of a serpent-tailed dragon that the Bible calls Satan, you have a variety of occultic imagery. When questioned about his satanic overtones, Dio declares, "I've always been out there saying to people to stay away from evil. There's something really wrong with the dark side of life. Jimmy Page is heavily into black magic. I've just been involved in white magic, which is for good and not for bad. By that I mean things like having contact with the spirit world via seances." Well, there you have it, rock and roller. If you're a fan of Dio, he says, "I have contact with the spirit world via seances." 14-year-old Eric Anderson plastered the walls of his room with heavy metal posters. His favorite bands were Ozzy, Black Sabbath, and Motley Crue. His parents say Eric and his friends listened to heavy metal, rock and roll day and night. Finally, his grades dropped. He started experimenting with drugs. Then one day, Eric Anderson placed a rifle to his head, and he took his life. His last words were, "Dad, I just can't cope with the pressure." Certainly young people are under a great deal of pressure today, but there's more to it than that. That pressure is coming as well from their rock and roll idols and the negative influence that they're having on these young lives. A couple more examples. The band Infernal Overkill on its album Destruction has songs like Death Trap and Black Death. The album Feel the Fire by this group pictures members of the band standing in front of a blazing inferno, not in a fearful stance, but almost worshipful. The rock group Slayer has an album entitled Hell Awaits. Souls are seen falling into the abyss as a horned Satan beckons to them. Their album Show No Mercy also pictures a pentagram and Satan with a goat's head wielding a sword. Another album is entitled Haunting the Chapel. A symbol describing their album shows an axe dripping fresh blood. An advertisement describes them as wicked, rampant metal waging havoc with juicy string bites and quick drum slashings. Now, do you get the imagery of violence and sexuality, of sadomasochism that they're seeking to convey, even in talking about and promoting the album? Mercyful Fate is one of the more satanic bands. The leader of the group, who calls himself King Diamond, has a reputation as a devoted Satanist. It's been rumored they anoint the crowd with human blood, they fill a doll with pig's entrails and ritually sacrifice it, and even strip on stage a woman dressed as a nun. On the front of their album, Metal Forces, King Diamond is shown clutching a nun's bosom and biting into her neck with 2 streams of blood trickling down her chest. His lyrics declare, "I deny Christ the deceiver." Diamond says, "I believe in the philosophy of Anton LaVey. I don't believe there's a heaven with pearly gates and all those people running around playing harps. The thing I call Satan is the power in the universe that keeps things in balance. Evil is necessary in this world, or how else could you appreciate good?" I mentioned the group Venom a little earlier. They have an album called At War with Satan. That doesn't mean against him either. And here's what's on the jacket. "Look at me, Satan's child, born of evil, thus defiled. Thanks to all the crazy venom legions of the world, we stand as one. See you in hell." Ironically, heavy metal bands and their fascination with hell and death is paradoxically appropriate. What they fail to see is that someday death itself will be cast into the eternal flames of the lake of fire, as we're told in Revelation 20, verse 14. Unfortunately, though hell has been prepared for death, demons, and the devil, Revelation 20, verse 15 warns us it is the eternal destination for whosoever was not found written in the book of life. Back to the group Venom for a moment. It's interesting. The drummer for the group goes by the nickname Abaddon. Now, I doubt if most of his fans know the source of that name. You know what's taken from the Bible? Revelation 9, verse 11. Let me read it to you. "And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon." Do you know what the name means? Destroyer. A symbol of death. Think about that the next time you're listening to your favorite rock and roll band. I mentioned the book Only the Good Die Young a little earlier. In it, rock writer Robert Duncan writes about 20 rock heroes who met untimely deaths. In an appendix of his book, the appendix is entitled Rock and Roll Heaven, he lists 67 rock stars who died, most of them as a result of drugs. Among those for whom chemical addiction and alcohol were factors are James Honeyman Scott of the Pretenders, killed by cocaine; Janis Joplin, killed by heroin; Keith Moon of The Who, destroyed by barbiturates; Bon Scott of AC/DC, died of drugs and alcohol; Jimi Hendrix, barbiturates; Tommy Bolin of Deep Heavy metal bands sing about forbidden behavior, immorality, and rebellion. Is it any wonder they also sing about death? And so many of them die so young. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 reflects on this. Forget not my law. Keep my commandments. The length of days and long life and peace shall they add to thee. If you're a rock and roller, especially into heavy metal, I ask you, do you want to live long? Would you like your life to be peaceful? Then don't forget the law of God, and you won't find it listening to heavy metal rock and roll. You've got to decide. The emphasis on death fills so much of today's music. Jeremiah 21, verse 8, puts it this way. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. That's what's set before you. The way of death is through listening to the message of heavy metal rock and roll with its themes of Satanism, death, and destruction. The way of life is through Jesus Christ. Which one will you choose?
This is the end of the message. For further information regarding other topics available on cassette and in printed form, write Bob Larson Ministries, Box 36A, Denver, Colorado, 80236.